June 4th, and welcome to another edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. Professor Jason Nichols joins us via Skype, and Bruce Fein is in our studio broadcast house. We welcome you both to the broadcast, and thank you so much for joining us. You know, I have not seen in recent memory the fixation on the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial right literally down the street in Fairfax, Virginia. I mean, when it was all said and done, Jason and Bruce, John Depp had about 1.6 billion people around the world following the trial. The same evidence, the same case, was before a UK judge some time ago, and Depp lost that case. And yet you say had the same evidence presented before the Fairfax judge, and he won unanimously, just on every charge. Is there that big a gap between a verdict being decided by a judge versus one being decided by a jury, Bruce?
Well, it can be, but that's not the only distinction. You may recall in the UK case, the defendant was Sun newspapers, which you could argue was a more favorable defendant than Amber Heard here. And Johnny Depp could have sued the Washington Post, which published the allegedly defamatory op-ed. Well, the jury found it was defamatory, but he did not choose the Washington Post as a defendant. I think the calculation was, newspaper, the Washington Post has a reputation here. Don't pit Johnny Depp against the Washington Post, but against Amber Heard. It was a much more likely success story. But it's surely true that the jury has an ability with their secret deliberations to consider a lot of other things that would be a little bit extra legal, but we'll never know about them because you basically cannot penetrate the cloister of the jury room. That would have caused them, because they liked, based upon the personalities, one over the other, and came up with a verdict. Because it is true that in this particular jurisdiction in the United States, Depp had a higher standard of proof to surmount, actual malice, and it was the burden of him to prove falsity. In the other situation, it was the burden on the defendant to prove truth, which the Sun newspapers were able to do. So you put all that together, and it's clearly that he made a far more favorable impression on the jury than Amber Heard did.
You know, Professor Nichols, it was interesting, Ms. Heard's statement after the verdict. It's a setback for women. Women will have very great difficulty in coming forward, and yet others are saying you cannot always assume that men are always guilty because women lie just as well as men. And but while some see it as a setback for women, they see it as an encouraging sign for men being falsely accused.
Well, I try not to look at this in terms of gender. I try to look at it in terms of truth versus falsehoods. And what we saw from Amber Heard was that she could not substantiate a lot of the claims that she made. She made claims that she was being punched. If you look at Johnny Depp, he always wears rings. She did not have the injuries that you would expect from being punched with somebody, by a man, particularly one that wears the kind of jewelry he wears. I think there were all of these things swayed the jury to believe that she was, at the very least, overstating what it is that she was claiming. So I try not to look at it as a situation where men get a win or women get a win. What we want is for truth. And I think whenever there are these kinds of allegations, they should be taken seriously. You shouldn't necessarily believe one gender over the other. It should be looked at, taken seriously, look at the evidence, and then make a determination based on that, but not how we have it many times in the media, where it's a gender war. I think that that's reductive and not good for anyone.
If I could just add a footnote to those observations, which I concur with. One of the lessons, I believe, not relating to what you raised, is the fact that here the defendant should have just said, raised the question of whether what she said was defamatory, rather than alleged a counterclaim, where she then had the burden of proving he did all these things. If she had not made counterclaims and simply said his burden of proof is to show that I knew that I was lying when I made in the op-ed I suggested I was the victim of domestic abuse, she had been a lot better off. But she purposely injected into the case her own affirmative claims against Johnny Depp, which then underscored the importance of her own credibility in order to survive. Anyway, it suggests she should have been satisfied with just winning as a defendant rather than going on the offense.
For full disclosure, obviously I have a very close relationship with Johnny Depp's lawyer. But what's so interesting about this, I mean, even the case Kate Moss, when she said she was pushed down, it says you have to be very careful when you inject and bring other people into your trial. I mean, it was none of the stories. I mean, some of the stuff was just obvious lies. I could just be kidding about it. I mean, it was almost comical to a point, Professor Nichols, and I think the public, as well as the jury, just absolutely saw through the theater.
Yeah, I think she certainly overstated her case, and was not believable to a jury. I think, as Bruce already stated, she made some wrong calculations, and even by countersuing for a double the amount that he was suing for, it just seemed like it was done out of spite. It didn't seem like she wanted to clear the record, and I think it was a smart move legally, and I know I'm kind of repeating what Bruce was saying, to sue her directly because of the fact that she's really the person who made the claims, not the newspaper, not the Washington Post, not the Sun-Times. It was her who made these claims, and they were just the platform that published it. So, the burden of proof, is on her, and she made a really poor legal calculation here. And, also we have to understand that we're dealing with two actors. So, who was the jury going to believe? And I think people, one argument for Amber Heard can be that Johnny Depp is a more convincing actor than she is. So that's one thing I think can be in her back pocket. He has more fans. So I think a lot of people were also ready for the untold story of men being abused, which actually happens and happens often. I think people were ready for that story to be told. And I think all of those kind of weighed in Johnny Depp's favor in this particular case.
So, Bruce Fein, moving overseas, the United States is not committing to missiles, rockets to the Ukraine fight in Russia. Is it a miscalculation? Will there be a greater price that we're paying? And also, I want to say this. We were talking to intelligence sources, which we talk to often, and we've been covering these stories for the last year, and there's not been an instance where they've been inaccurate. Now, I must admit, I hope they're inaccurate in the latest. They're saying that it's almost 75% with certainty that Russia would eventually nuke Ukraine and maybe Poland.
I don't know whether it's that level. I myself lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I can guarantee you I thought the likelihood of a nuclear Armageddon was 1,000,000 times greater than it is at present. It didn't happen, despite the stakes being so much higher. Now, it's true that the intelligence people are on record here as saying that the United States is preparing a non-nuclear response if tactical nuclear weapons were employed, not trying to avoid any kind of escalation. It seems to me that given the more limited objectives that Putin has now adopted after he was unable to take Kyiv, he would be unlikely. What is it for him that he can get with tactical nukes that he can't get just by the overwhelming forces that he has in terms of numbers and weapons over Ukraine, even if it's over just the eastern portion? He goes back, he's got a monopoly over the media and says, hey, this is a great victory. I just think that's a little bit reckless given the precarious stature he currently has with the economic embargoes.
Douglas Blair, you're finally joining us, news and producing podcast. I must tell you, I literally did not even see you on the Skype. It's just a fact. I didn't see you. So I'm not going to sit here and try to play a hypocrite. But welcome to the broadcast and your thoughts on what you're hearing.
Absolutely. Well, let's start with Ukraine. Ukraine is definitely one of the big scenarios that we need to deal with right now, and Vladimir Putin's attack on the Ukrainian people is one of the biggest issues of our times. I do think it's interesting the way that the U.S. has responded to the Russian attack on Ukraine, simply because there are two things at play here. One, we absolutely do need to support our ally in the region. Ukraine is a democratic state. We want to support that versus the Russian oligarchy and the Russian autocracy. But then two, we don't want to put too much of our troops and too much of our military strength behind this, because we also have problems here at home. So it's impossible for us to say, like, oh, we're going to go to bat for you for the entire time. But we do need to show Vladimir Putin that we're serious and that an invasion of a sovereign state like Ukraine is not tolerable and that he needs to back off.
You know, there was another killing on this week in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a hospital. Goodman killed 4 people. I mean, it just seems like every week, Douglas, every week, we can't even get a break from what happened last week in Texas, and yet another. It goes to show you, with the best law enforcement, the best intelligence, if these people who are mentally disturbed, are angry, or upset about a procedure at the hospital, they're going to find a way to blow people and blast them to thithers.
Absolutely. And that's the saddest thing about this, is that people will try to point to this as a gun issue. They'll try to point to this as a mental health issue. It's a combination of pretty much everything. As a society, we have become so undone from the values that we used to hold and the values that used to bind us together as Americans, that these types of things are going to happen with alarming frequency until we return to those values that makes life worth it. I want to, this might be slightly tangential, but one of the things that we were watching when we were covering a lot of these protests surrounding the Roe v. Wade case is that there was this idea that life doesn't matter, that life isn't something that was worth protecting. So we see that bleed out into things like these shootings, where if you're already a person going into these scenarios believing that life is just a thing, it's something that you can snuff out with no problem, then of course we're going to keep seeing these because life isn't worth it. What we need to start doing in America again is reinvigorating a culture of life, is bringing us back into this idea that no, it's not just a person, it's not just a thing, it's a human being that has value, that has worth, and that's worth protecting.
You know, Professor Nichols, it's as though you would think, watching the devastation of parents and innocent children being killed, seniors being devastated in a grocery store in Buffalo, New York, anybody who would even be thinking about something like this would step back and say, wow, do I want to bring about that kind of pain upon a family and a community? It's as if now they're encouraged to carry out these things that they've been feeling inside without delay.
Yeah, I think that Douglas made a few good points. There are certain things that I would probably diverge from. But one of the things that I agree with is that we do have a cultural problem in this country. We do have issues. I would recommend, there's a book called Heal the Hate that talks about some of the people who have committed some of these atrocious crimes and some of the things that they have in common. I think that we need to start studying these things. We need to study internet radicalization that we saw with the shooter in El Paso in 2019, that we saw, of course, in Buffalo 2 or 3 weeks ago, and also our situation with young men and how we can make it so that young men don't resort to this. I think, though, at the same time, with some of the things that were mentioned in terms of mental health and guns, is when someone is having a mental health crisis, that we need to have a red flag system, that they do not have the ability to go in and commit these atrocious crimes and to take the tools of mass destruction out of their hands. I'm certainly pro 2A, but I think that there are limits in order to make sure that people can go grocery shopping or go to the doctor's office or go and drop their kids off at school and feel some semblance of safety. And so I think that there are measures that need to be taken, and one side takes one set of measures and another side takes another. But I think that one of the things that we need to do is have a conversation with both sides.
Well, we have, actually, Professor Nichols, we have Leon Spears and Mr. Pratt from the Gun Owners of the Association to talk about the solutions and what we need to do. But look, I want to thank you and Douglas so much for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. Bruce Fein is going to stay with us, and we'll be back. Erich Pratt is the Senior Vice President for Gun Owners of America. Of course, Bruce Fein is a philosopher with Fein and Duvall. And Leon Spears is President Owner of the D.C. Concealed Carry. And I'm going to also add, Leon Spears is the first D.C. resident to qualify for conceal and carry. To me, that is he paved the way for those that carry in the District of Columbia. I want you to talk about the importance of the New York Gun Association versus Bruin that the Supreme Court heard in November of 2021, and a decision should be coming down soon. What that means for New York and the rest of the country, Mr. Spears.
Bruin is going to be critical because the facts of the matter are that most states don't have a restriction for may issue, but there's some states that are essentially no issue. New Jersey, New York, California, Hawaii, they don't issue concealed carry permits. Even if they fall within the criteria of getting a concealed carry permit, they just do not issue concealed carry permits. And people need to have what's called a may issue revoked. So shall issue shall stand, and if you fall by the requirements, then the jurisdictional authorities need to issue a concealed carry permit no matter what.
Bruce Fein?
I think that given, and this is not the first time New York has got to the Supreme Court, the last time they escaped a ruling because they knew they were going to lose and revise their decisions. But I think if you examine the current makeup of the court, it's likely to strike down the New York law. But the way in which the court has ruled in general in this area is very narrow and case-by-case specific. I very much doubt whether they'll try to issue a broad ruling saying in general almost any regulation of handguns or rifles is unconstitutional. This is Justice Scalia's opinion in the Heller case, which was the flagship case in 2009, saying that his decision was not intended to strike down reasonable regulations. So I don't think that the ruling will have nationwide impact. It will be New York specific, and it will keep the debate that we're now having in the aftermath of Uvalde in play.
You know, Erich Pratt, and forgive me for not being sensitive enough and politically correct, I did not understand why everybody wanted to boycott the NRA. I just did not get it. Well, how would the NRA further impact what happened in Texas and Buffalo and now in Tulsa? I just don't get it. I just don't. I mean, and then you had the president stated that 9mm caliber guns should not be banned, not realize that it's the most popular caliber in the country, and you would ban most of the guns, which he clearly didn't understand his gun language, which is why he backtracked. Have we become so overly sensitive about what's going on in this country? And it is a nightmare. It's horrifying what is happening with these massacres across the country. But it seems to me it would be more of an argument that law enforcement cannot do their job alone, Erich, and you need responsible, well-trained citizens who qualify, conceal, and carry, who can at least give another chance, another alternative to protecting the lives of innocent Americans. Erich?
Armstrong, you are absolutely correct. We have to stop making our schools soft targets. You know, the Border Patrol agent who rescued several children from the school in Uvalde, he believes that teachers should be armed. And according to polling, 81% of cops agree with him, and with good reason. Did you know that no school has ever had a mass shooting where there were armed teachers and staff? There are thousands of schools across 20 states where teachers are armed, and there's not been an attempted mass shooting in any of them. And that makes perfect sense, because many mass shooters have indicated by what they've said to others or by what they've written in their manifestos that they specifically sought out places that didn't have security, or they targeted places where they knew people were disarmed. Armstrong, I could give you examples from the recent Buffalo shooter, or the Aurora Theater and Charleston church killers, or the Pulse nightclub shooter. They all indicated that they were steering clear of places where there were armed people. So it's no wonder that 94% of the mass shootings in this country, public mass shootings, occur in gun-free zones. I mean, we have to let that sink in. 94%, these killers are choosing these areas 94% of the time. They choose places where they'll be the only ones with guns. They're not selecting police stations where bullets are going to be flying back at them.
You know, Leon, I grew up with guns since I was a boy, 2 or 3 years old. I mean, my brothers and sisters, we all have firearms legally. I'm like Leon, one of the few people in the district that has conceal and carry. And just because you have a firearm doesn't mean you're going to be able to defend and protect your life. We saw that with the law enforcement officer in Buffalo, New York, where he could not penetrate the clothing that demon was wearing. But still, Leon, it seems as though anytime this happens, it ramps it up where it makes guns the enemy. And criminals who listen to this must be encouraged, because they're going to find a way to get a firearm and keep their firearm no matter what the law is, because they have no respect for the law or the rule of law. How do we not make guns the issues and deal with this thing called mental illness and the fact that these people put manifestos on the internet and these social media companies should notify law enforcement right away? The guns, it seems to always end up being the thing that's demonized.
I think it's all reverted right back to training. If you train, then you train hard, you train well, then the gun is not the boogeyman. And then most people that feel empowered after they get trained, they understand that they need to respect firearms. And most of the time, people don't understand until it sadly happens to them that the police are always minutes behind, and they're always cleaning up the act. And so law enforcement officers want people to be armed that deserve to be armed. So if you're a qualified person, then sure enough, you should be trained well, and you should practice often, and you should carry a firearm or be able to at least defend yourself in your home. But most of the time, a lot of these people do not have training. And then they just read what's on the internet, or they have a family member that might have been in a situation that was very detrimental, and then they just run with that. So they don't engage in self understanding of empowerment with firearms.
Bruce, Boudin is seeking re-election as the DA in San Francisco, California. I think everyone has come to the conclusion that he's going to be ousted. Like many other DAs that ran as progressives, there's issue of bail, being soft on crime, misdemeanor, putting these criminals back out on the street. They're committing the same crime and sometimes committing homicide. Has the pendulum swung again full circle?
Well, I don't know whether it's full circle. It certainly swung back. No one's running on defund the police anymore. Even in the jurisdictions that were most avant-garde, if you will. And it wasn't just limited to the gun or law enforcement. The school board out in San Francisco also got a licking because they were trying to engage in indoctrination, and they elected new panels there. So I do think that you can't get away from human nature. This idea that by exhortation we can all engender angelic DNA genes isn't going to work. Unfortunately, there are things that we don't know about the species, and people can be evil, and if you don't have deterrence and someone who's going to detain them and arrest them and imprison them, crime will spiral. One of the things that we do know is that a huge disproportionate amount of crime is considered by a tiny percentage of the entire criminal population. They commit hundreds of crimes, even thousands, and those are the people that we can't afford to let out to continue to prey on the community. But I want to go back to one of the points you made about why is the guns the centerpiece of the conversation. It's because it's much more difficult to go back to the culture and change people's self-image, how they think, how they raise children. That's a far more difficult thing. It's easy to just grasp on to what you think is an elixir, and you pass the law and suddenly you've cured the evil. I mean, it reminds me of prohibition. All the prohibitionists think, okay, we ban alcohol, then men aren't going to be drunk anymore, they won't beat their wives. That didn't really happen that way. Because unless you change the underlying culture, the law becomes honored in the breach rather than the observance, and that's what we've not gotten to here. And with regard to this idea that mental illness is the real source, I think the studies show that within the mentally ill population, they're less likely to commit a crime of violence than people who aren't mentally ill. I'm not saying that we should give mentally ill people firearms, but they're not the kernel of the problem.
Erich, Pratt, you know, I'm very sensitive to the other side who has fear of guns. They blame guns. You know, Chicago has some of the toughest and most restrictive gun laws in America, and yet it has some of the highest crime and homicide rate. Is there a way to bring both sides together, to find common ground? You know, the House is now trying to pass legislation, knowing it's just for theater. It's not going anywhere. It will never pass the Senate. It will never become law. But is anything that we can do that has not been done?
Armstrong, it's going to be really hard to find common ground. You know, when I spoke earlier, I mentioned we need to have, 81% of cops support having teachers and armed staff, those who are willing. The Democrats don't want to do that. At the national level, in fact, Senator Chris Murphy, who's pushing gun control right now, just 2 years ago, during the whole defund the police craze, he was saying he was pushing legislation in the Senate to get even armed school resource officers out of the schools. See, this is where wokeism is killing people. They think that even having police in our schools is a bad look, that having armed police, even though they're good guys with guns, they think that's a bad look and they want to get rid of that. Well, that creates that makes every school a soft target. And this is the problem that we're facing. One thing that's not getting a lot of attention is the very day after that very tragic school shooting in Texas, in West Virginia, there was a good gal with a gun who used her concealed carry handgun to save the lives of 40 people. A guy showed up at a graduation party with an AR-15. He started shooting. He was going to gun people down. She pulled out her 9mm, the one that the president wants to ban. She pulled out her 9mm Glock, shot back, killing him. That ended the threat. Imagine if there had been one of the thousands of schools in our country that have armed teachers. Imagine if one of them was at that school in Texas. 70% of the schools, sadly, in Texas are not participating in the program where teachers can be armed. 30% do, 70% do not. Uvalde School, sadly, was not one of those.
Leon, you have the final word on this subject.
I think that people should be armed. And it's just like, do you wear your seatbelt because it's against the law if you don't? Or do you wear the seatbelt because it's safe? People made arguments in the 50s and the 60s that seatbelts will, wrinkle your clothes and harm you. And it's just the mindset. Erich is correct. And you just need to infiltrate people's mindset to see training and education is paramount. And then once you empower people, then they understand, okay, guns are not that bad. You just need to be respectful, and then just don't infringe on others. But you just want to have it and then not need it. So I just am just so annoyed by the fact that people are just infringing on others to say that they should not be able to carry or defend themselves, when that's what we're founded on as a Second Amendment country. So I just have no idea what's going to happen in the future in regard to concealed carry. I hope Bruin is ruled favorably and then may issue. And again, to your other guest in studio, I really believe that sensitive places are still sensitive. The Second Amendment is not absolute, as the late Justice Scalia had actually said. So I understand that there are sensitive places where your guns should not be, but again, train law enforcement officers, resource officers, they're deterrents. And so the very, very few deranged people, those second guess their deranged actions if you have qualified people in places that our children are. Things just have to change, and I think well-trained people and educated people will be empowered and will see the light of day.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Coming up next, we're going to talk about inflation and economy. And coming up later on the broadcast, we're going to have a discussion with Ryan Jones, who's a candidate right here for the D.C. Attorney General. That and much more on this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show. We'll be back. Douglas Ayers is president and CEO of Largo Financial Services, wealth strategist. And our good man, Jordan Goodman, financial guru, America Money Answers, joins us to talk about this economy. What is America's economy? Are we heading toward a recession, or is this just a bear market, Douglas?
Man, we are, things are changing fast, and recession is something that we experience every year, but this one is looking very different, and it's something to really get a handle on quickly.
Is there more that everyday Americans can do to protect themselves from what seems to be no end in sight for their way of life, the fuel prices, the food prices, the utility prices inside their homes? Can they cut and save more? Can they make more sacrifices? Are we requiring them to do more as this continues?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, one thing that I teach families to start doing is start looking at the places that they're throwing money away unknowingly because they don't know they're doing that. For example, like the way they are making extra payment. If they're making extra payments on mortgages, they need to stop doing that. If they're making extra payments on debt like credit cards, they need to stop doing that. The reason is they're taking their, what I call, using simple interest money that they could be putting into a compounding interest account and giving it away, to the banking institutions that don't really want the money, already giving you a loan to do whatever you need to do, but instead redirect that money to start investing for their future so that they could offset this inflation as it continues.
You know what's interesting, Jordan, as much as we talk about the American way of life is no more, many Americans are continuing to go on vacation. They're continuing to enjoy their sporting events. They're continuing to buy online. They're continuing to buy vehicles. And while we're asking them to make more sacrifices, it seems as though whether they found a way or not, much of their lifestyle really has not changed, unless I'm in the dark.
Well, like over Memorial Day, 8% higher vacations than we had the year before.
Right.
Even though the gas prices are at all-time record highs in the high $4 range, soon to go into the $5 range, people just go out and drive it anyway. I think it's going to be a very busy summer travel season. You're exactly right. I think people's incomes are up to some extent. Not everybody, but a lot of people's incomes are up. And so they're going out and spending anyway. He was exactly right that you have to cut back on non-essentials to be able to pay for the essentials. I mean, it's costing you $100 or more to fill up your gas tank these days. If you're in California, it's $7. It could cost you $150 to send up your gas tank. So it's really taking money out of what otherwise people would be spending on restaurants and more discretionary kinds of spending.
I just saw, even with colleges and universities, they're all raising their tuition by 4 to 7%.
Right. It's going to be, and that's going to be debt. I mean, people don't have the money, so they're going to be taking on that much debt. And this is debt that you pay over 30 years, Armstrong. This is not short-term debt that you pay off quickly. Universities are doing it, but everybody. Airlines are raising fares. Rents are going up a lot. The price of homes is up an average of 20% over the last year. So that means a lot of people can't afford homes, so they're staying and renting, and rents are going up 10, 13, 15% in many cases. It's across the board, and President Biden has no clue what to do about it. He met last week with Fed Chairman Powell and basically said, you take care of it. I don't know what to do. You raise interest rates, that'll solve inflation. It's not going to work.
It's very interesting, Douglas, because the Airlines Association just said to the president and his administration, we need to stop all these COVID protocols, all the testing. It's collapsing the economy. It's having a dramatic impact on the airline industry, and we just need to do away with it all.
Man, hopefully that will help. But we've always had pandemics anyway, and the most important thing is how, other than getting rid of the all the rules and regulation and that, what else is the government looking at doing to offset this inflation and help the American people, be able to afford renting? Because a lot of people are not even able to buy homes right now. Homes are out. I mean, it's so expensive that people are struggling in that arena, and the minimum wage hasn't gone up for people either. So it's just a crazy thing. I mean, the airline industry, which is true, but of course, that means people got to travel more, and even the airlines are tapping into this and overcharging on their airline ticket. Everybody want to catch up on the money they lost during COVID, and the American people are the ones suffering for it.
Why don't you explain to our listeners why many Americans don't really know the real value of their assets and why the Fed should have raised interest rates much sooner? And while it's tricky now, where is it that the Fed needs to get to in terms of raising interest rates, and how will that begin to impact the economy and costs will continue to go downward, Jordan?
Well, I don't think the Fed raising interest rates, which they're clearly going to be doing, is going to impact inflation that much. Look at the reasons for inflation, okay? First of all, the Federal Reserve created $8 trillion out of thin air. Their balance sheet went from $1 trillion to over $9 trillion. So that's inflationary, all that money chasing around there. The federal government spent a lot of money on stimulus and COVID relief. That money's kind of been out there. The labor shortage. We have 11.5 million unfilled jobs in this country, Armstrong. And as a result of that, employers need to hire people, and they have to pay higher wages to attract people. That has to be passed on in the form of higher prices. Clearly, there's commodity shortages in oil and food and other areas. That's inflationary as well. The supply chain is a real mess. We have over 200 ships waiting off the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach to get in. That stuff is not getting to where it needs to go. So these are all structural reasons why inflation is much higher than it has been in the past. And everything I just mentioned is really not impacted by higher interest rates from the Fed. So yes, the Fed's going to raise rates, but I don't think inflation is going to slow down.
Douglas, what is it that the president can do in terms of policy that can change this trajectory and then within a few months give everyday Americans and the economy some needed relief?
Yeah, definitely support the small businesses, because a lot of the small business entrepreneurs are the ones employing the folks, and hopefully give a good tax break for the small business owners to be able to support the American middle income America that are working hard every day, making sure that the economy continues to move, and give those small businesses an incentive to hire more people and do more, and then give people an opportunity to be able to scale and do better.
Jordan, can this administration change the high fuel costs? Is it more than just a policy issue? Is it as simple as Republicans and those on the other side, the president's critic, try to make it seem?
I think we've discouraged drilling of oil and gas in this country in a major way, and that's one of the things that's causing oil prices to go up so much. OPEC is meeting this week, and we're hoping that they increase production by maybe 500,000 barrels. Russia produces 4.5 million barrels a day, so that's being taken off the market. There's a shortage of oil, Armstrong, and that's why prices are up to almost $120 a barrel. And what you're seeing at the pump is going to be over $5, over $6 soon. So we're not taking full advantage of the energy we have in this country. They are specifically discouraging by environmental rules, by taking public lands off of lease. There's a lot of things they're doing to discourage oil and gas drilling in this country, and that's really hurting us badly.
Douglas Ayres and Jordan Goodman, thank you so much for joining us on this economy segment. When we come back, Ryan Jones, who is a candidate for Attorney General right here in our nation's capital, will be joining us. We'll be back. So, Mr. Jones, you grew up in Washington, D.C. on the 16th Street. Your family's had tremendous impact on you. You have family members involved in the real estate, so you understand the housing market. And one of the things that you advocate and running for Attorney General is that you want to protect the people. How do you protect people from rising crime in our nation's capital? What is not being done that you can do differently?
I think we are all looking at symptoms of a design that's not equitable. And I want to make sure that the law is equitable, and that means revising code. That means getting people the resources that they need. We're talking about root causes. However, that's a long-term situation. In the short term, we need immediate fixes. And I think that means we're putting more people in place to protect residents. If we're putting people in schools, whether they're resource officers or mental health officers, putting nurses in situations that can help control students a bit better. We're being creative. We're making sure that people are getting the appropriate needs so that they can live a more quality life and not resort to the criminal element.
Explain a little more your definition of equitable vote.
Right. For example, we have a housing crisis in Washington, D.C., where there are not enough affordable housing, and we have people who are historic residents being pushed out because of pricing. A neighbor comes into the neighborhood, they revitalize their home, and that creates a higher property tax for that historic resident, and they can't keep up. So we need to revitalize, amend the code so that historic residents can stay next to their new rehabilitated neighbor, so their property taxes aren't pushing them out of their homes. Things like that. That's equity. We're making sure that licensure isn't too expensive for the startup company that is trying to get going so that they can create a meaningful opportunity in whatever their neighborhood may be and whatever their business market may be. But costs seem to keep people out of business and keep them from picking themselves up.
Do you see small business owners, corporations, as part of the problem or the solution?
Small business owners drive America. We watch larger companies oftentimes buy smaller companies. So having people step to the plate with new business ideas, new business initiatives, creating a market for themselves that creates enhanced value in their community, that's the whole basis behind having an LLC. You're operating and you're putting a product or service out there that enriches our society. And so small business owners do that. And then they sometimes get bought by larger businesses, would then implement those into those companies' initiatives, which then helps bring up that small business to a mid-sized business or a larger business, and the wheels of the economy move.
You know, when you talk to the citizens of our nation's capital, two of their greatest, their most pressing issues, 1 and 2, education of their children, the educational system, and feeling safe at home and in their communities. What can you do differently, whether it's the bail, whether it's misdemeanor charges, whether you're making sure that youth are not back out on the street commit the same crime, and you may feel that some of the crimes are not worth spending the resources on, we can better spend D.C. resources. But what would a D.C. look like under your leadership as Attorney General when it comes to how it would impact the rising crime in this city?
You've highlighted a numerous amount of issues here. So when we do arrest young folks, because the Attorney General has oversight over youth crime and adult misdemeanors, we're making sure that they are being held accountable. The theory of holding people accountable, you create deterrence, generally and specifically by punishment. But we want to make sure the punishment is commensurate with the crime. We want to make sure that when people are punished, they're not being pushed to the margins of society and don't have a chance to return and do meaningful things that enriches our communities. So that's why expungement clinics are really critical. And we'll have to do it on a case-by-case basis, but it should be readily available so that when young people are committing crimes, they don't have a record that then precludes them from seeking higher education or a job, things that we all come to agree makes our society better when we have people that are educated and having meaningful jobs. So that's one thing I put forth with our expungement clinic. However, you're talking about certain other programs. That's working with counsel, writing laws a particular way, and working with the mayor's office. They have the ONES unit, and we have Cure the Streets at the Office of Attorney General. They need to work more cohesively to find ways to stem crime, and maybe we even need to be more creative. If we know that we have identifiable young folks who are continuing to be in certain issues, maybe we put them in reform school. That seems to benefit other young folks. Maybe we can have our inner city youth have those type of opportunities. So they are seeing something else, seeing something different, being educated different, and then they come back and they can enrich their communities with what they've learned.
You know, this is also consistent across the country. Less than 12% of the people commit 100% of the crime. And it would seem as though if someone who's arrested falls in that category, that this has been their trajectory, it would seem that you would have a harsher penalty, and the likelihood of this person coming back to commit that crime will be drastically reduced.
I think you scale it out. What does that mean? The first time a person commits a crime, you treat them a certain way. If they return after giving them all of the resources possible, you take a different step, you take a different measure, because what you did the first time didn't work. That's just normal ways to treat a problem. You experiment. But we can't keep trying to over-incarcerate, because that doesn't work either. If we recognize that as what the United States has the highest incarceration population of all other nations, but we're not yet the safest. So we have to start reimagining how we punish. And I think it starts with how we educate. I think it starts with how we allocate resources. I think it starts with how we provide opportunities. And that's when I get back to rewiring the system to empower people. And we do that with the law, how it's written. You're writing to make sure equity is built into it. We're making sure that everyone has a better chance to succeed in this world, so that they can enjoy a standard of living that they don't turn to the criminal element.
So, equitable, God, we all are created equals in God's sight, but we all make different choices. We all make different decisions. And, you know, when we make those decisions, sometimes they can uplift society, sometimes they can push society back towards the margins. How do we get back to the family? I mean, you have a strong relationship with your family, great respect for your father, great respect for your mother. You know, it's almost unusual today, because oftentimes you see men and fathers as the enemy, and they're not uplifted, they're not empowered, they're not celebrated the way they once were. But you have to admit, culture wars and people's belief systems and how they grow up, the things that happen to them at the youngest and most tender age impacts them for a lifetime. How do we get back to the home? And how do we get back to fathers?
That's an excellent question. And I think you've identified it. If we do that, we do have a better society. You know, a child not embraced by their community will set it on fire to feel its warmth. And we have to do better making our children feel embraced. If we're doing it through church, if we're doing it through programs that the government sponsors, if we are just changing culture, as you've mentioned, through what's perpetuated through many outlets that we are now infecting our children with and young people with. Where are we going to put love back into the conversation? Understanding the family basis is how people will succeed, knowing that wealth is passed down, not created in one generation. So it's passed down through generations. And that changes the trajectory of many people's lives. Having resources and having a family does that. The family structure must be uplifted in our eyes through society, knowing that that's where we'll build a formidable future and a sustainable society.
And finally, in about a minute that we have left, people have to understand there are also consequences for their behavior, to remind others that this is unacceptable.
I look at parents and parenting starting that understanding. Parents rearing their children. You know, my mother and father were strict on me, but it paid off dividends, I believe. I think that level of parenting, parents staying on top of their kids, sending their children in a positive trajectory, knowing that the punishment is for their benefit. Now, we have to protect children as well, because parents aren't rearing their children appropriately. And we have to do a better job of balancing that. And as Attorney General, you try to make sure that the laws, our standard operating procedures, how our government works with children, works with families, creates that balance, strikes that balance. And having leadership with those values will be reflected in society.
Mr. Jones, we appreciate your stopping by our broadcast house to sit and talk with us about your vision for the city as Attorney General. We will continue this through the November elections in this fall. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of the Armstrong Williams Show, WJLA 24/7, and all our guests today. Enjoy the remainder of your weekend.